Geology, Geology, and Geology. This is Daniel Minizini, your inquisitive geologist. Welcome everybody to the weekly mini geology radio show from KPFT HD2 channel, Houston, Texas. Welcome everybody to this program where we put in connection our beloved geology with society at large. Today we'll talk about the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, this new age related to the behavior of man, proposes that humans have become a geologic agent. In other words, humans have impacted upon the working of the earth as a whole. We'll talk about it with Professor of Human Geography, Nigel Clark. He's professor at the Lancaster University in UK, even though he is on the other side of the world in New Zealand today. And Professor Nigel Clark will help us understand the link between geology and social science. Hi Nigel, are you there?
Greetings Daniel, greetings from Auckland, New Zealand on a windy day.
All right, we're so glad to have you on that other continent. Mini Geology puts in contact a lot of geoscientists and people related in geoscience around the world. I'm so glad that you are calling in, and thank you for bringing in this special link between geology and social sciences. You make a living as a social scientist, not as a geologist, but you know well geology. So tell us more. What is the link between geology and social science?
Well, for me, partly it's coming from New Zealand, which most geologists know. It's at a tectonic plate juncture. It's pretty shaky ground. The city I come from, where I am right now, Auckland, we've got about 30 or so volcanoes. Most of them are dormant. We had an eruption just a couple of weeks ago, White Island, just off the coast. So I come from a region that's pretty shaky and pretty unstable. And long ago, when I was still doing my training as a social scientist, I realized that, the Earth is pretty significant. That everything we do is in some senses underpinned, subtended by Earth processes. And that's kind of unusual for a social scientist. We like to think of ourselves as being entangled with physical things, but we don't tend to think in terms of the Earth processes being the kind of condition of possibility of being a social being. So right from the beginning, I was kind of a difficult, stroppy social scientist in that I always had these questions about, how does the Earth make us, shape us? Not just how do we shape the Earth, but how is the Earth the kind of the condition of being a social being, a social agent? So I'm kind of an unusual social scientist that, although I'm not trained as a geologist, I find Earth processes fascinating, and not just in the sense of how do we respond to them, how might they be hazardous, but also how do they turn us into, shape, condition the kinds of beings that we become. Another way of looking at that is just to ask the question of whenever we do something socially as social agents, we always in some way join forces with the Earth. We're always tapping into or channeling or making uses of things that the Earth has made available for us. So I'm really interested in the question at the moment. We know about climate change. We know about all sorts of kind of environmental impacts. But what does it mean for how we might join forces with the Earth differently? How might we be different kinds of geological agents? So that's really the kinds of questions that kind of drive me and excite me. So I find myself constantly drawing upon, inspired by, in conversation with geologists. There's also a lot of things that I don't know as a social scientist. So I rely upon reading and conversations with geologists, a whole range of kind of earth scientists, really, for inspiration in a lot of ways.
So, Nigel, you collaborate with geologists, and you know very well the environment where the geologists have their ideas. But you, and you belong to both of the sciences, the geosciences and the social sciences. Can you tell us what is the difference between a mindset of the geologist, where you already expressed that is affected by this will to understand the earth processes, and the difference with the mindset of a social scientist?
That's a good question, and in part I think I'm a strange social scientist in some respects, so I'm not entirely sure how ordinary social scientists think. But I guess, in a way, most earth scientists, most geologists are trying to explain how it is that certain processes take place. But in a lot of senses, I think, geologists especially, a lot of them are already engaging with particular communities, particular societies, because they're aware they're working with things that are hazardous, things that are risky, or also that they're working with things that are resources that different communities or societies need. So quite a few of the geologists that I've worked with are actually have a lot of experience of working with communities and social groups. There was one geologist I worked with, Mike Pedersen, who's a volcanologist, who had spent about 4 or 5 years in the Solomon Islands, and in some senses he was a really good social scientist already. He already understood the local people. He already understood that whatever he was saying about volcanoes had to be in conversation with local people. So he was actually quite a good ethnographer, and I learned quite a lot about the culture and society of the Solomon Islands from him, from a volcanologist. So, there's interesting kind of, two-way movements. I guess the average typical social scientist is much more interested in the questions of how social forces, social formations construct and shape both the way we experience earth processes, but also shape our vulnerability. So there's a big kind of set of questions around who has the power, who has the agency, who is most vulnerable, who is most exposed.
So, Nigel, I'm pretty curious to understand you as a human being. How have you been shaped along the way? And so why are we talking with you? Why you are a special social scientist?
That's a good question. I think in some respects it goes way, way back to when I was at primary school in the very early 1970s. And I had a teacher then when I was about 12 years old, who was a very, very early environmentalist. And he really got me into thinking with and through and about the environment. So when I arrived at university as a teenager to study social science, I was already, in a way, more interested or very interested in environmental processes. So I arrived with a set of questions that I found that social science sometimes really helped me with, sometimes was really useful, and sometimes fell short. So somewhere around the early 80s, I started to be very interested in climate change. And I was kind of a little bit told off by my social science lecturers, my sociology lecturers, who said, you shouldn't really be treating climate change as a thing, as if it just exists out there. You should only be looking at how it's constructed or interpreted. And I got a bit frustrated by that. And in a way, I've been a little bit frustrated with social science ever since, which makes me a sort of sometimes a slightly kind of grumpy, contentious social scientist. But there's two other things that were kind of crucial for me along the way and really pushing me in the direction of engaging with earth science. And one was around the end of the 1990s, coming across the idea of abrupt climate change, realizing that global climate could shift in 5 or 10 years. And I realized then that this is something that really every social scientist needs to know. And shortly after that, 2004, the Indian Ocean tsunami, and just this reminder that tectonic plates don't just move slowly, and that the Earth doesn't just move gradually, and that this can have sudden, huge impacts. And again, that was something that kind of nudged me along as a social scientist to really take, big, significant Earth processes seriously, and to realize that the conditions we take for granted, the ground beneath our feet that we so often take for granted as social scientists, just in many ways cannot be trusted. That it can move and shift and change in hugely consequential ways, and that also kind of nudged along my thinking about the importance of Earth science.
Nigel, I would like to have a deep dive now into your studies. I thank you for a document that you sent me, a preprint, which is the introduction to a new book that you are writing. And you say that questions of what our planet has been, what it is now, and what it might be capable of becoming are vital questions. Why are they vital questions?
Okay, so this is you're referring to the book I'm currently writing with my colleague from Lancaster, Prof So we've come up with this idea of what we're calling planetary social thought. So we're saying that again, everything that we do as human beings is in some way conditioned, made possible by what the Earth can do, what our planet can do. Also in the background of this, we're both quite interested in recent discoveries about exoplanets. So the idea that the more we find out about other planets out there in the cosmos, the more we realize that the Earth is just one variation on the theme of what a planet can do. The more we realize that there are seemingly infinite possibilities of what a planet can evolve into, what a planet can become. So we're kind of interested in how the Earth is just a variation on the theme of what planets are, and what it might be to think social life in that sense of planets being these changeable entities, planets being able to kind of learn to do different things over time. One of the reasons that this, for us, matters, as social scientists, is that we're at a moment in the kind of history of our modernity where we really need to think differently how we engage with the Earth and its resources, the Earth and its flows and its different strata. So we know that we have to stop relying on fossil fuels so much. That's kind of obvious, I think, to most of us these days. But that doesn't really answer the question of how else we might engage with the Earth, what other strata, what other flows, what other kind of reservoirs in the Earth that we might tap into. So what we're trying to do in the book is really put together the idea of the Earth having these kind of multiple possibilities, the Earth itself being able to transform itself, put that together with the question of how are we to engage with it differently, rather than just saying no to fossil fuels, to open up the question, well, what else are we going to do with the planet? How else are we going to engage with it? What other possibilities? Thinking of the Earth really as almost kind of infinite in its possibilities. What other possibilities, potentials are there that we could engage with, make use of? So I guess what we're trying to do is move away from the kind of just say no approach to fossil fuels, and say, well, what are we going to say yes to? And in order to do that creatively, we're really kind of digging into the long-term history of the different ways that different human societies, different social formations have really tapped into different geological formations or different flows in the Earth system. So trying to get away from the kind of negativity of what we can't do and move towards the positivity, the potentiality of living on a planet that's really, full of all sorts of possibilities.
When you move towards
that back too.
Nigel, when you move towards these new possibilities with positive approach. Which kind of data do you need? Or your research is more metaphysical or not really based on hard data?
Yeah, that's a good question. To be honest with you, we don't provide a whole lot of answers. We're not kind of discovering things and giving recipes or programs to kind of get out of the current predicament. So I would say it's partly metaphysical. It's also kind of quite speculative. So we go back to certain moments where different human groups discovered some quite kind of unexpected things, joined forces with both life and earth processes in ways that would have been, quite hard to anticipate. To give some examples, one of the things we talk about is just the invention of weaving, the invention of textiles as a way of using the fibers that life makes possible. Another example being the use of high heat technology, the use of kilns in ceramics or metallurgy or glass making. So it's really taking a deep dive into the past uses of earth processes. So rather than actually make suggestions about what we could join forces with in the future, we're trying to encourage a kind of a creative rethinking of the way we've done things in the past that just kind of opens up a sense of possibility. So we're not making kind of big predictions about what should be done, what needs to be done. We're trying to kind of encourage a way of thinking that is in some ways a bit more speculative, a bit more creative, a bit more playful in the way we think about earth processes and the resources that the earth makes available.
Nigel, when you have your students and you meet, what are the materials that you look at? What are the things that you study? What is the very basic material that you analyze in order to come up with these propositions, this positive approach?
Okay, one of the things we do is just look at different kind of social formations, different kind of moments in history, different cultures across the planet, and we talk about what sorts of forces of the earth do these people join up with. One of the ways I get my students to think is we talk about, rather than an autobiography, having a stratobiography. So I say to them, where do you come from? In your region or in your hometown, what forces, what processes of the earth have people made use of? So my students tell me about, coming from agricultural communities, coming from mining communities, coming from communities where they use certain sorts of stone in different ways. One of my students talking recently about ley lines, running through her town. So that's one way that we talk about things. Another thing I do is just to kind of bring along different objects, everyday objects, and just it might be something like an axe or a needle, and just say, this object, what forces, what processes of life or the earth come together or have been used in this object, and what does this object enable us to do? So, just things like a compass or a knife, just objects like that. And we work through those objects and try to get the students thinking not just about those objects as being embedded or entangled in social processes, but also expressing or manifesting different kinds of earth processes. So that's one of the ways that we kind of do that in class.
Thanks, Nigel, for explaining the methodologies and the key questions of your studies. Now, I would like to move on that topic that I presented at the very beginning, which is the Anthropocene. So we have to say that according to science, humans trigger not only climate change, but many other actions like the loss of biological diversity, extinctions, the acidification of oceans, the thinning of the ozone layer, changes in the cycles of nitrogen and phosphorus, the pollution of the aerosol in the air, even transforming the landscapes and the geomorphology of the Earth, and also changes the way in which fresh water flows across the surface of the Earth. So the atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen in 1999, it dropped the term Anthropocene, expressing the idea that our planet was undergoing these fundamental and maybe irreversible changes. So how important was the creation of this new term, Anthropocene?
Okay, for us, I guess for a lot of social scientists, the big challenge of the Anthropocene is really just recognizing that humans have reached a point, or at least some humans, where they are geological agents, where they are impacting upon the entire kind of working of the Earth system to such an extent that they will leave a lasting trace in the geological strata. What Bron Jasinski and I are doing in the book is something a little bit different from that. What we're picking up on is the idea that really the Earth system's thinking that's behind the Anthropocene is really talking about the possibility of different aspects of the Earth system and the Earth system as a whole really having a kind of a multiplicity built into them, so that if it wasn't for this multiplicity, if the system didn't have the potential to be other than it is now, then all the human impacts wouldn't really make a kind of huge amount of difference. So the big question to us, what we learn from this as social scientists, is what does it mean to be on a planet that has multiple operating states? What does it mean to live on a planet that has in the past changed, shifted many, many times from one operating state to another? So it's really what we refer to that in our kind of shorthand term for that is planetary multiplicity. That we inhabit a planet that's, in a way, it's integrated, it works together as a coherent, single, integrated system. But because of that integration, it's capable of shifting in totality from one state to another. So that's the side of it that we're picking up and really raising as a question for social science. What does it mean to be on this, find ourselves on this planet, to have evolved on a planet that has multiple operating states? And that idea of an inherent multiplicity of the Earth being as important to us as the idea of kind of human impact upon the Earth. So just really coming back to that question, that the only reason why we as humans run the risk of nudging the climate or biogeochemical cycles into alternative states is because those alternative states are already there, because the planet itself is already multiple. And that for us is I think, more important, at least as important as the whole kind of sense of humans being, impacting on the Earth as a whole.
Was it important, the simple thing of having a new term, the Anthropocene? Was it important because everything was already in place? The understanding of the climate change already exists before 1999. But when the community decided to use this term, was it important for you as a social scientist?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have to admit that at first I was a bit frustrated with the term. As a social scientist, talking to other social scientists, I've been trying for many years to kind of decenter the human, to say it's not all about us. We really have to think of a planet that's been doing really interesting things for, 4.5 billion years, that humans are very much latecomers, whatever they managed to achieve in the last few centuries. So I was a bit frustrated with this term coming along that appeared to put humans again on kind of center stage. So for me, I was a little bit frustrated with this term that made it sound like it was all about us. So one of the things that I try and do with the notion of the Anthropocene is to say that, for sure, it puts the spotlight on humans or certain groups, classes of humans, as geological agents. But that only makes sense if we take into account all the other processes that were there going on long, long before us. On the other hand, I've got to admit that as a concept, as an idea, as a way of signaling and bringing together a whole lot of different problems, challenges, I think the Anthropocene has been a very, very clever idea. I mean, it's probably the most important and the most popular kind of scientific idea of the 21st century so far. And a lot of social scientists have tried to come up with their own versions. They've tried to talk about the Capitalocene or the Plantationocene or various other things, none of which has caught on half as much or a quarter as much as the Anthropocene. So in a way, I think you've got to hand it to the people, to Paul Crutzen, the Anthropocene Working Group. They've done a really, really good job of publicizing a whole range of issues with a very, very catchy kind of rebranding. And one of the things that I come back to, or that we come back to in the book, is that, as you mentioned, a lot of these developments in the earth sciences really coming about, since the late 60s, since the confirmation of plate tectonics, since the beginnings of the Earth system thinking, since the idea that the Earth is open to kind of impacts from space, all these things gradually kind of building up the sense of the Earth as an integrated system, over 30, 40 years. The Anthropocene being a kind of a rebranding, a way of bringing all these things together, giving a kind of a popular and memorable title to it. So I've learned to get along okay with the term itself, and I realise that it really does good work in really putting geological processes, earth processes, centre stage. And I think there's been no time really since the late 18th century where earth processes, geology, have been so much on the agenda as they are now. And I think we really need to give credit to people like Paul Crutzen, Jan Zalasiewicz, and the Anthropocene Working Group, really give them credit, a lot of credit for making geology something that ordinary people are much more interested in than they would have been 2 or 3 decades ago. And I think that the Anthropocene itself does very, very good work at bundling together and integrating a lot of things. So reminding us too that climate change is not the only problem. As you mentioned before, all these other potential threats, planetary boundaries that we need to protect, all these other threats to the Earth system. The Anthropocene has been quite good in reminding us that there are a whole range of things that all interact and that they're all important. Perhaps, climate change is still obviously getting a lot of the attention, but I think that it's really important to keep thinking of things like the phosphorus cycle, the nitrogen cycle, biodiversity loss. These are, in many ways as important as climate change. So the Anthropocene is super useful, I think, in bringing all those things together and really publicizing them. There's no social science concept in the last 20 years that's been half as successful as the Anthropocene. So I think we're probably a little bit jealous. We're probably a little bit envious that concept has done so well. But I do think we need to make use of it.
When you study the Anthropocene, do you place an age? The base of the Anthropocene is something that you in social sciences and in the geosciences agree?
Yeah, I'm not. That's not something I find really important. I'm more interested in the long-term build-up. I know that the archaeologist Matt Edgeworth, who was part of the Anthropocene Working Group, he and some of the other members of the working group have come up with a kind of a counter thesis, which is really that the important thing is to think about the long-term ways that humans have gradually acquired and built up their kind of geological agency. And just reminding us that trying to put a date on something as small as a matter of decades or even a matter of centuries is really kind of out of keeping with the usual kind of chronologies that are there in the geological timescale. So it's demanding a lot to try and narrow them down to a few decades or even a few centuries. And they make the point that it's quite problematic and quite a challenge for the earth sciences to really try and go into that kind of fine grain. So I kind of quite like the idea that the crucial thing is not the moment at which a whole lot of different kind of impacts add up to one specific kind of level of change in the Earth system, but to really think about how it was that we acquired those sorts of agency. And again, that takes us back to the question of how and when we join forces, with various sorts of Earth processes. And I like the idea of really tracking that back as far as we can into kind of human evolution, rather than putting so much emphasis on identifying that kind of precise moment of transition. So I'm not really too fussed whether it's the great acceleration of the post-war period or whether it's the early industrial revolution, or even whether it's the moment of the linking up of the continents when Europeans invaded the Americas. I think the important thing is to think in terms of how humans gained their power, their geological force, and they generally did this, fairly gradually, over long periods of time.
So, Nigel,
that to me is more important
in broad terms, you think that maybe something like the agricultural revolution, something going back thousands of years, maybe 10,000 years, is, in a broad sense, one of the very first signs when human beings start becoming a geologic agent?
Yeah, that's something I keep going back to, the Holocene. And in many ways, for me, one of the exciting things about the Anthropocene, and this is for other social scientists, is we're actually beginning to discover the Holocene and earlier epochs. I think the question about agriculture is really interesting. The way I would think about that, if we go back to the agrarian civilizations that emerged in the mid-Holocene, is that humans really, when they start to use irrigation, they're really joining forces with sedimentary processes. Okay, so you think of sedimentary processes being one of the great kind of geological rock-forming processes. So by learning to irrigate, to use irrigation, to collect sediments, by doing that, in a way, we're becoming a kind of sedimentary being. We're joining up with sedimentary processes. What also interests me is that around the same time, you're really getting a takeoff of metallurgy. And what people do with metallurgy in kilns, they crank their kilns up to, the same temperature as a volcano, basically, 1,200, 1,300 degrees. So, in a way, when you put together metallurgy and you put together irrigated agriculture, you're kind of putting together humans tapping into igneous processes and humans tapping into sedimentary processes. So in a sense, we're becoming igneous beings, sedimentary beings. So I look at that moment of really the intensification of agriculture in the mid-Holocene really as a moment to look at how humans started to use geological forces in different ways and really started to kind of bring them together as they'd never been brought together before. So it's not just a matter of human impact, it's a matter of what have we channeled, what have we tapped into, what have we brought together that wasn't being channeled before. So that's the kind of questions that for me come out of that, early Anthropocene, agriculture question that you've raised.
I listened to your disagreement on the maybe etymology of the Anthropocene, too closely related with humans, as if the humans they were maybe the only agent changing the planet. So, what are other weaknesses, other limitations of the concept of Anthropocene that you have been explaining right now? Could it maybe be used as a political weapon?
Yeah, I think that one of the interesting things about the Anthropocene is that the earth scientists, the geologists who were using the term, realized right from the beginning that it was political. So it comes at a time when, earth scientists, particularly because of climate change and other problems, are aware that whatever they say, whatever they do, has political significance, political importance. So I think when Crutzen made that intervention in the conference, back in 1999, he knew right from the word go that this was political, that he was making both a scientific intervention and a political intervention. And I think on the whole, that politicization of earth science is very, very important, and it's something that as a social scientist, I'm very, very enthusiastic about this recognition that scientists know that they're political actors and what they say matters on a political stage. I guess there's a standard kind of criticism of the Anthropocene and a lot of the ways it's expressed and the ways it's couched that comes from social scientists, which is to say that it brings humans together as if they were a whole, as if they were one, where we really need to be very, very conscious and aware of the great differences in who the agents are, who's doing the damage, who's making the difference, and who is on the receiving end and who is most vulnerable, and to really think about the power relations. And that to me is really important. We need to keep that in mind. But sometimes I think that social scientists can use that really to kind of repossess or to take hold of the Anthropocene thesis as if it was their own. I think we need to be careful not to treat it in that way. And also, if you look back at Paul Crutzen's very early paper, the Geology of Mankind, he points out very clearly in the middle of that very brief paper that only about a fifth of humankind have been responsible for the changes that he's talking about when he talks about the Anthropocene. So he made that fairly clear at the outset. So I think we should remember that too, that I don't think most of the scientists involved with the Anthropocene are naive enough to think that every single human being is, equally responsible. I think they know that, and they kind of tend to take that for granted. But it is something that a lot of social scientists do get, a little bit grumpy about, a little bit critical about. That sometimes still talking as if human agency means all of us. So we need to keep that in mind.
1/5 of the population on Earth created the problem, but should we all try to fix the problem?
Yeah, there's a whole lot of really, really tricky and interesting questions about that. And one of the sets of questions that is now arising is the whole idea of kind of decolonizing our thought, which means that we can't just assume that Western knowledge, whether it's social science or natural science, is the knowledge that we can take for granted for the entire planet. So there's a lot of kind of questions about different groups, indigenous people, traditional people, what their contributions are to thinking about something like the Anthropocene. So I guess what comes out of this at the moment is that one of the big challenges is, can we think with and through the Earth, as the Anthropocene kind of concept encourages to do, but can we also decolonize our thinking around the Earth? And to do those two things kind of at the same time is very, very tricky, because, really we need the science for all kinds of things, and it's quite hard to find ways of bringing together all the different ways that people experience and engage with nature, with living or earth processes right across the planet, including bringing together or bringing back traditions that have been kind of, overwritten, sometimes kind of, disassembled, destroyed by the impacts of the West. We need to think about those things simultaneously. I think that's one of the trickiest things at the moment, one of the biggest challenges, how to really take the science and the understandings of science seriously without imposing those understandings on people who are not necessarily in agreement with all of them, or who have fundamentally different ways of understanding or conceptualizing their.
Can you
their
explain
world.
us, Nigel? Can you give us a couple of examples of something that is other than the Western scientific thinking? In which way other populations they may think about the problem that we are debating on now?
Okay, I think you might have had a chat to Adam Babette a while back. And he's someone whose research I really like. He's done some great work about people living in Java, in Indonesia, near to very active volcanoes that could kind of kill them at any time. And he gives some great examples of the way that people imagine, communicate with, attempt to understand or live with a very, very kind of dynamic environment. Partly by, communicating with all sorts of kind of earth beings or spirits, or really using these as ways to kind of mediate the danger that they're living in. And he kind of draws an interesting set of contrasts between Western scientists trying to understand the dynamics of volcanoes and traditional people, particularly animist peoples, trying to find ways of living with the danger, the constant kind of threat to human life. And that in some respects, they do slightly different things. The scientists try and predict the volcanic eruptions. The animist peoples, with the help of their shaman, with the help of the spirits they're trying to mediate with, try and live with the everyday problem of living in danger. And that people come up with all sorts of different, sets of entities, spirits, ancestral beings, as ways, really, of living with, experiencing, enduring, very, very risky, uncertain conditions. So that's an example that I find, really useful.
Yeah, I remember we interviewed Adam Babette in the episode 82. So this is episode 89. So as you see, we have a recurrency on the topics which at that time I call political geology. And it's something that we care because it really affects geology at large. Yeah. So Nigel, what would you like more from geologists?
Okay, that's a really good question. I've generally find that geologists have been very, very generous in the work I do. That whenever I need some help, whenever I make kind of mistakes, as I do, not being a trained geologist, I find geologists tend to be very kind of generous and very helpful. And people like Jan Zalasiewicz have come along to workshops that we've organized, come along and joined us on panels, and have been very, very helpful, very generous in helping, engaging in discussions around things like the Anthropocene. So what would help me from geologists? Really, I guess there's times when geologists do need to be a little bit more sensitive to some of the power relations. I mean, you're talking about political geology. They need to be aware of, the different ways that different groups, different cultures across the planet think about things differently. But having said that, I also want to say that a lot of geologists know this. A lot of, seismologists, volcanologists working in different parts of the planet, they already know this. They're already communicating. They're already in conversation with local people. So in that sense, I think that, geologists are doing a good job. And, I think at the moment, in the last 20 years, I think that geologists, earth scientists, have been doing a wonderful job of putting some really important things on the agenda. I guess that the one kind of big fault line is that there's so many earth scientists now who are engaging with, big questions of environmental change. There's still a lot of geologists who are, still trying to locate, new reserves of fossil fuels. So there is that kind of tension in geology itself, the tension between wanting to engage with, these really, really important global problems, putting them on the agenda, making sure that we understand them, and that idea that there's still, quite a lot of geologists who are still kind of funded by the fossil fuel industries and doing day-to-day work, involved in finding fossil fuels. So there is, I guess, that tension that within the discipline itself deal with.
Do you have any suggestion in order to solve that question, that tension?
I think again that's kind of a question that the discipline needs to really resolve itself. I mean, I'm not sure what happens when earth scientists who are really concerned with boundaries in the Earth system, with climate change, what happens when they meet with the earth scientists at conferences who are still, concerned with locating, extracting fossil fuels. I'm not quite sure of what happens when those two groups of geologists kind of get together and how they resolve their differences.
But this is interesting, and it's interesting listening to you because geology is not a perfect science, and it constantly works with multiple hypotheses, sometimes indicating, yes, the most likely solution, but far from proving it. So geology doesn't give certainty as physics or chemistry do, and it is important to know somebody from outside the geological sciences to look at the geological sciences, give an opinion. So I would really like to listen to you more, because I also read a sentence in your introduction to your book where the philosopher Timothy Morton says that geology finds itself confronting an abyss whose reality becomes increasingly mysterious. So what's your diagnosis for the discipline of geology? Is geology undergoing an existential crisis?
If it's a crisis, it's a very productive crisis. I think that whole kind of discovery of what we're talking about calling planetary multiplicity, that whole sense that the Earth itself could take away with very little forewarning, that the Earth itself could take away the conditions of stability, the conditions under which we know and understand the Earth. It could even, take away the supporting conditions for us as a species. So I think one of the interesting questions for geology is what it means to be theorizing or researching from a threshold or from within a threshold, rather than just researching, making statements, theories, propositions about those thresholds of the Earth system, to ask the question what it means to actually be poised on that threshold, or to be, in some senses, within it. What does it mean for the way you do science, that you act as a scientist, to actually feel yourself caught up in, really immersed in those kind of threshold transitions that you're talking about? And I think partly the politicization of geology, the realization that what geologists say has political importance, is partly beginning to come to terms with that idea that we're not just theorizing about the Earth, we're theorizing from being positioned in particular places, but also in a particular moment in the Earth system. So I'm really interested in how, Earth scientists, geologists, experience that moment of being, on the threshold in that moment that is so full of uncertainty. I think there's big questions for the discipline that come out of that kind of positioning that really interests me.
Nigel, now that we have investigated together the twinned concepts of one side planetary multiplicity, and on the other side the earthly multitude, so the many different ways in which humans can see the Earth, not only the Western science. So all in all, what planet are we on?
Well, that's a very good question. I would say from what we know, I think we're on a particularly interesting, a particularly kind of dynamic planet. One of the things that I get from from Earth scientists is the idea that the plate tectonics that we have on this planet, although there may be plate tectonics on other astronomical bodies in our solar system, that our plate tectonics are particularly lively, particularly kind of fast-moving, and that these have played a part in the emergence of life on Earth. So one of the things that kind of interests me is that we live on a planet that's far, far from boring. We wouldn't have a species as interesting as human beings if we weren't on this kind of dangerously dynamic planet. We probably wouldn't have any life at all if it wasn't for living on a kind of a dangerously dynamic planet. So just that sense that being on a planet that is multiple, that is in some ways probably very dynamic compared with a lot of other kind of astronomical bodies, that the kind of the endangerment, the risk is also tied up with the potentiality and with the kinds of life forms that have emerged on the Earth. So I think of the question sometimes as, what kind of planet made us the species we are? And even if we're an exceptionally damaging and exceptionally troublesome species, some of that comes back to how we've responded to living on a particularly demanding and challenging planet. So really, you can't have one without the other. You can't have a species like us or complex life forms without having a dangerous, uncertain, volatile planet. That really you've got to think of those two things really as together, that you don't get one without the other. So it's a risky planet, but it's done us fairly well so far.
And do you think, Nigel, that this concept of dangerously dynamic planet is something new? It's something that the society at large understands now, or not necessarily new?
That's a good question. I think an awful lot of societies in human history, cultures right across the planet, have lived with close to all sorts of dynamic processes, whether they're droughts, whether they're cyclones, glaciers coming and going, all sorts. Humans as a species have been close to, impacted upon by a whole range of dynamic Earth processes. I think a lot of traditional ways of understanding the Earth, particularly where cultures have long-term memory about the different states, the different transformations that their environment can go through, you do get a lot of understanding, deep understanding of the dynamics of the planet. If not the planet itself, then at least the kind of the local environment. I think there's also an important moment when, particularly in the West, we start mining, quarrying deeper and deeper into the Earth. We start discovering those layers, we start discovering those fossils. So I think really in the 18th century, there was this moment in Western thought of really starting to kind of get a sense of just how dynamic and dangerous this planet could be. There's also, I think, around the late 18th, 19th century, a kind of stepping back, a recoiling from that, and a slowing down into a very long, gradual evolutionary time. And I think in a way that kind of early confrontation with a dynamic planet has kind of come back. It's kind of after a couple of centuries of putting it on the back burner, I think it's now come to the forefront. So I think now that whole sense of living on a dynamic planet is not going to go away. I think it's kind of building up. I think long, slow evolutionary time helped kind of smooth or iron out the concerns about a dynamic planet. Now we've come back to the idea that things can change very fast. I think that dynamism is going to be a big factor in culture from here on in.
So now with this new sort of awareness and this new knowledge, should we change our perspective on our human life?
Well, that's what I'd like, and I think we need to think seriously about the way we organize our social life and about the way we organize our economies. Having a system at the moment, we can call it free market, we can call it capitalism, a system which goes for maximum economic growth, which tries to convert every available resource into some sort of production, into some sort of consumption, into some, reprocess it back into some kind of economic growth. That, for me, is not the best way of using your resources on a dynamic planet. Because of one of the big problems is it doesn't really leave much in reserve. And the more that your planet is capable, or you understand or recognize that your planet could really take you by surprise, the more that you need to leave things in reserve. You need to have some spare space, some spare ground, some spare energy sources. You can't use everything up. If everything's already been brought into, incorporated in the productive system, then there's not a lot of kind of leeway if you're taken by surprise. So one of the things I'd like to see is some serious questioning about the global economic system on the basis of the kind of planet that we live on. Not just on the basis of our impacts on that planet, but on the basis of the fact that the planet will change anyway. And the idea of a system that leaves things in reserve, that leaves considerable aspects of the surface of the Earth not completely utilized, that I think is really important. And I think as yet the kind of the critique of the current economic system, it draws a lot on increasingly on environmental impacts, but it doesn't quite think as yet enough through the fact that even without human impacts, this is a planet that takes us by surprise, and that an economy needs to consider, any sort of economic system needs to consider the possibility that the planet that we take for granted is only one moment, and that it could change without warning. So that for me has really, really big kind of political and economic implications for how we organize economic and social life.
Thank you, Nigel. Thank you for the deep breath that you are giving to the geoscience in general, for the audience, the things that I'm learning listening to you, and for the links of the geological sciences with the social sciences. I think that those links are very important. We as a community in the geological science, we would like to help. I appreciate you said that the geologists, they have been kind to you, but if we have to produce more data or different points of view that help society, I think that that's something we still need to learn, because we like so much the rocks and the sediments that sometimes we remain there too much.
Nothing wrong with liking rocks and sediment. They're fascinating things, rocks and sediment. But thank you so much for your questions. They've been very, very provocative. They're great questions, and there's a few things there to get me thinking further as well.
Yes. So we were in conversation with Nigel Clark, professor of human geography at Lancaster University in UK. And this was another episode of Mini Geology. And minigeology.com is the YouTube channel where you can listen to this interview again. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nigel, for participating in Mini Geology.
Thank you, Daniel.